let me give you a little background. Through the 1950s, Havana was a major transshipment point for Italian and French connection heroin that was coming into the United States. And of course, the Mafia had set up casinos and hotels in Havana, and was making a lot of money there through gambling and prostitution and all the usual kind of vices that it specializes in, and that's the service that it provides to people. And one of the services that it provides to people who are looking for a good time is cocaine. And so it was Americans who wanted to do a little cocaine, guys who wanted to get laid and couldn't get laid at home, gamble and not have any to worry about any limits and stuff like that. They went to Havana. It was, at the time, Cuba was known as the whorehouse of the Western Hemisphere. And a lot of the cocaine came from South America up through the Record network, which I was just talking about. The heroin was coming in from the Far East, and there was one particular Corsican named Paul Mondoloni who was responsible with his organization bringing most of the heroin that was going into Cuba. And he worked with a particular mafioso named Santo Trafficante. The Trafficante family was the ruling family in Florida, out of Tampa, but it had pretty much control, was the most important mafia family in Havana, through arrangements with the other families in Meyer Lansky. After 1959 and the Cuban Revolution, when the CIA realized that Castro was not going to align with the United States, and then he actually was, that it actually was a communist revolution, the CIA tried to knock off Castro. They wanted to assassinate him, and actually hired this mafia boss, Santo Trafficante, and engaged his services in trying to bring poison pills and into Cuba to kill Castro. We were talking earlier about the MK Ultra project. You know, it's sort of loosely aligned with that. Through the MK Ultra project, the CIA was creating all sorts of bizarre assassination devices. Anyway, at that point, Trafficante, once he went to work for the CIA, was protected for the rest of his life, even though he was the main importer of narcotics into the United States. He kept his drug French connection, maintained his French connection. He was never arrested by the United States. For anything, even though it was known that he was perhaps the main drug trafficker in the world at that time. But he was involved in plots to kill Castro and overthrow the government, and he was making not only his Italian organization available, but all the Cubans that were part of his organization, he was making them available as well. The Cubans that were aligned with Mondoloni, the Corsican, and the Mafia, resettled fled Cuba and resettled in Miami, and over the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, Miami grew fantastically, at a fantastic rate. It had been a backwater city in the United States, and within 5 years, it was becoming one of the biggest cities in the United States. A huge city. The C.I.A. actually set up. It's the only base it ever had in the United States. What was it called? JM Wave Station, and it relied on Trafficante and the Cubans that were part of his crime network to launch raids into Cuba, to try and disrupt the Cuban economy, to try to assassinate Cuban leaders. There always had these the whole Cuban exile community in Miami after the Bay of Pigs fiasco entertained ideas about reconquering Cuba and claiming it back for themselves. But as it became apparent that that wasn't going to happen, they just simply turned all their energy to smuggling cocaine.
CBS News has learned from drug enforcement officials that networks of other CIA veterans based in Miami have been actively involved in cocaine and marijuana smuggling for several years now. For example, one of the traffickers is a pillar of Miami's Cuban community. He spent more than 5 years with the CIA running operations in and out of Cuba. Several years ago, he turned his skills to smuggling drugs from Latin America to southern Florida. According to the CIA case officer who directed the CIA's commando operations, upwards of 2,000 Cubans were given training that could be useful in the drug trade.
You have to remember that on all of these operations that they did in Cuba, they practiced them in the Florida Keys and then the coast of Florida first. Using the Coast Guard and the Marine Patrol and so forth here as enemy units and to avoid them. And of course now it's child's play for them.
So if anybody in the world knows how to get past whatever barriers we can erect, it's your old CIA agents?
Well, you have to remember that the sites that they were using as practice landings here are the sites that they're using today for landing drugs. And these people have come into those sites on practices upwards of 100 times, over and over and over again. So they know every inch of they know every rock, every tree, everything about them.
And do they know how the Coast Guard works, what they do, how to avoid them?
But they probably never have had to utilize over a fraction of those skills because our coastal patrols and defenses against drug traffic here is very weak compared to what they were up against in Cuba.
CBS News has learned that state and police investigators have taken testimony from a key witness, now on the federal witness program, who alleges that an active-duty CIA officer, as well as a high-ranking customs official, were involved in the drug ring the police are moving on now. Once the trial begins, these and other allegations are sure to surface. What now seems to be clear is that a sizable number of the CIA's old secret soldiers, trained and based here to wage a secret war against Fidel Castro, are now fighting instead on the wrong side of the drug war.
Because they had this free pass as part of the Trafficante organization, because nobody could bust Trafficante, and because they were fighting Castro, and as Castro and the Cuban Revolution spread throughout the Caribbean and South America, just like the French had used the Corsicans in Algeria, the CIA used the Cubans in the Caribbean and South America to start fighting the communist insurrections, the communist rebellions that the Cuban Revolution was spreading there. And of course, the payoff for the Cubans was the freedom to import heroin and cocaine into the United States to pay for their operations and as a payment for their engaging in these in this sort of paramilitary political espionage operations. And by 1970, the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs realized that this Cuban connection was becoming the biggest drug importer into the United States of both cocaine and heroin. And once the BNDD had killed off all the Corsicans and French who were part of the Record organization in Central America, in South America, it coincided with this Trafficante Cuban connection taking over the whole apparatus. And by 1972, 73, 74, this Cuban criminal organization that was working for the CIA and was given free passage to bring drugs into the United States had taken over the French connection in South America, along in league with corrupt right-wing South American governments, and everything was the same as it had been before. And instead of the French Corsicans running the operation, it was the Cubans. And as the United States ramped up its efforts to put down these communist insurrections in South America under Ronald Reagan, it started targeting El Salvador and Nicaragua in particular. It turned to the Cubans to provide the same, again, function that the Corsicans had provided for the French in Algeria. And it relied on its Cuban connection to set up out of El Salvador and Nicaragua a drug network that was bringing cocaine into the United States, in particular to into Los Angeles. And they did it, of course, in league. The Cubans set it up in league with compatible El Salvadoran rightists and Nicaraguan rightists who wanted to profit from the businesses themselves. The CIA provided air transportation for the Contra drug network that emerged in the mid-1980s and started supplying much of Miami and Texas and California with the cocaine that was flooding the United States. But it was a direct outgrowth of these CIA operations against Castro and the Cubans and the communist Cubans, and this Faustian pact that the CIA had with the Mafia, with Trafficante and his associates in the Mafia, who were the ultimate recipients of the cocaine and distributors of it in the United States. And it's part of the same thing that's been going on since federal drug law enforcement was created and since the drug wars began. The government permits its allies to traffic, and it even provides them with protection through the CIA to bring their drugs into the country. And that's the Contra drug network in a nutshell.